So I just have actually one diapositive, because I don't really use images, mostly because I'm working on such a group that, I mean, we talked about it yesterday, but it's a group that has been labeling as gang, so it's really hard to put pictures like that. Anyway, what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about my project as a PhD student, and to talk about a new kind of theory that is called theory from the South, and about the circulations of concepts. So my work as a PhD student is actually to look at the circulation of a particular group that I talked about yesterday. And looking at the circulation of groups, you have to look at circulations of concepts. And this goes in the trend of all those globalization studies that are really looking also at the globalizations of concepts. So now the theory from the South is actually a title from the Komarov last essays, but it's also a growing field, and mostly in urban studies. And as I said yesterday, I'm an urban anthropologist. So basically the idea of theory from the South is that studying the South has been dependent on northern categories and theories. And authors like Ananya Roy, Capuch, Vanessa Watson, or Jennifer Robinson are trying to construct a South-North dialogue, arguing that we need to open concepts and reshape social sciences by uprooting it from its dominant northern origins. So as such, they use heuristically, and I think heuristically is really important to say, because they use the dichotomy between global North and global South, but we've also criticizing it. But we'll be able to talk it later in the discussion, I think. So what is interesting is that not only they argue that concepts have to emerge from what they call the global South cities, but also and mostly that those concepts should be tried in global North cities as well. So basically the idea is to think about the cities from the South, what they call from the South, and elaborate some concepts, some theories, and then try those concepts and theories in cities from the South. So actually do like the kind of contrary dialogue that we used to have. And it's really important in the special field of urban studies, because usually we're looking at cities, and mostly African cities, with like a Chicago school or Los Angeles school kind of theory. So, for example, Ananya Roy, she proposed what she called a transnational framework, and she basically said that we have to use transnationalism as an interrogative technique. So I just have to say that this concept and this whole theory from the South have emerged mostly from South African universities. And it's really important to say that because South African universities now have this kind of, in urban studies at least, have this kind of place that Indian university had or still have with this all post-colonial studies. And it's important because it's this new field that emerging from South African universities and really looking at mostly South African cities. So I'm in France. I'm part of a center that is an African center because of a lot of reason, but I'm part of this African center. And so my background is mostly on African literature, on literature on African cities. And I think it kind of provide another decentering perspective from Latino America. So what I want to do is to look at those theory from the South ideas by taking a concept that is predominant now in urban theory, which is the concept of informality. It's a concept that have been reshaped in those past 5 years, and now you can find it everywhere when we're actually talking about cities, but not only cities on the South, but also cities on the North. And So I want to divide this presentation in actually 3 parts. The first part will be, what do we say when we talk about informality? The second part is, what do we say when we're not using the concept of informality? And this is where I'm going to put my field in New York mostly. And the last part, which is actually a conclusion, is what do we not say when we use the concept of informality? So first of all, what do we say when we talk about informality? I want to start here by saying that there's an incredible amount of new literature on that subject, on informality. So I don't pretend to be exhaustive. I just want to kind of skim a little bit what has been done and what is done right now. But mostly, there's a problem of definition. When you look at informality, we don't speak about the same thing. First of all, there's a kind of disciplinary gap, because you have people from economic anthropology that are talking about informality, which is, they're not really talking about the same thing as other field of anthropology, for example. But we still all using the same term. But also, and this I think is my critique about this kind of theory from the South, is that we're using the concept of informality for a large different countries and continent. For example, we're using the concept of informality from in Africa cities, but also in Latin American cities and in US for my case. So the concept of informality, I think the way I can retrace it came from, the first studies actually in cities came from Hautes in 1973, and he worked on Ghana. And he was interested mostly in informal work organization. So from that, this notion has been used in international institutions such as World Bank, IMF, but also in more national institutions such as the US Department of Labor. And you have a definition of informality that is not exactly the same in each case. Then more recently, Ananya Roy, what I was talking about her, she was talking about the concept of informality from an Indian perspective. So what she said basically is that informality is the site of a considerable state power and violence. And for her, the state used informality to provide a flexibility in terms of planning and land use. So in Ananya Roy perspective, informality is a state of deregulation. And what she proposed on informality is that you cannot tag informality only with poverty. Now going back to a northern perspective on informality on cities, you have people like Ryan Thomas Devlin, who actually work on informal geography, street vendors in New York. And he discussed the concept of informality as a mechanism of governance. So for him, informality does not result by a state failure, but it's actually a tool for the state governance. You also could look at Robert Fairbanks, who made a beautiful work on Rockery House in Pennsylvania. And what he says is that you can see a development of informality in the welfare crisis. And he argued that informal social movements have internalized the contradiction of post-welfare urban society, leading to the emergence of a newer realm of urban poverty politics. So you can see just now that you have Ananya Roy, who says informality is not just poverty, and then you have 2 works in the United States that are tagging informality just to poverty neighborhood or poverty movement. And finally, I think it's also important to talk about Wish Tachel, who work on informality in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And what he says is that informality is a gray shadow. So he talked about the informality as a mode of production of space defined by the territorial logic of deregulation. So in general, in that literature, what we can say very briefly, what I tried to put very briefly is that there's actually been a shift in the previous literature on informality, where informality was emerging from a state failure and where the society, and specifically the African society with S, were defined as what they are not, what they are lacking of, and what they are lacking of was the state. So informality was actually coming from a state failure. And now you have a body of literature that explain how informality is actually a state governance. So you can see that we had this shift of taking conceptualizing the informality, but we're still talking about the same word. So now, what do we say when we're not using the concept of informality? And then here I'm going to use my field. I'm going to use the field in New York because I had more analysis about it. So again, I'm talking about this association that came from the Puerto Rican prison and that developed in the prison of NYC and then in the streets of NYC. So this group had, since its origin, what they call a fundo. A fundo, it's actually an internal banking system. So basically, each member put $5 or $10, it depends how they want it, each month together, and then there's a redistribution at the end of the month. It's in literature in Africa, it's called a tontine. You put money as a group, and then we will provide money for just a member or for a project. And in the past, before the pacification, this money was used to buy guns, basically. So the example of the internal banking system and the support system could be analyzed as an informal system. And this is how. If I use Venkatesh's point of view, it is part of an informal economy or a shadow economy that is growing in the ghettos of the welfare, of the ghettos of cities in the welfare crisis. So it will be seen as a response to the welfare crisis by the poor, the lumpen proletariat, as Philippe Bourgois phrased it, for the Puerto Rican population. So I could then go on saying that the importance of the fundo accentuate with the neoliberalization of the city of New York and the impoverishment of the gang members. For example, 70% of the male members of the association are currently without work. So it makes a fundo a very, very important resources and a proof of informal ties. So saying that, then you can use the literature on informal ties, saying that in the ghetto, actually, it's mapped with a tie between its inhabitants. And then you can use Carol Stack's influence book, All or King, on the role of women in the informal economy. And I could say, well, basically you have entire families that are dependent on those robust kinship and dependent on the fundo. So we will basically make an intervention within the importance debate that tries to explain how urban poor rely on kinship networks to survive to economic destitutions. And I will, in fact, have a lot of data on this kind of informal strategy developed by urban poor to survive the contemporary political and economic neoliberal globalization that induce poverty, ghettoization, and new form of urban injustice. And then you can say, well, basically the fundo is a site of resistance for the members. So basically this idea of saying that the fundo is an informal tie, it has an informal importance, came from two major arguments, and I just want to trying to put those two arguments and then showing you why it's kind of complicated saying it's informal. So there's two major arguments that can be drawn using informality as an explanatory concept. First of all, that informality is a moment when tradition structures regain forces as familiar basis. And then that it's also a basis for an autonomous accumulation and the formation of an autonomous entrepreneurial strategy. So both postulations are actually based on the idea and the principle of disengagement that could also be read as the exit strategy a la Albert Eichmann, either on the disengaging from the modern and re-engaging in the traditional, or disengaging from the capitalist and neoliberal frustration and liberate from the predatory state. So let's go on the first argument, which is the resurgence of traditional informal network. So The fondo, as I said, is not a new thing because it has been implemented since the origin of the association in New York and possibly actually since the origin of the association in Puerto Rico. For example, members of Los Nietas in New York define themselves as jibaros, that we could translate as hillbilly. The origin of this term is supposed to come from descendants of slaves that escaped in the mountains of Puerto Rico and refused to work in the plantation. They are seen as rejecting the law and social convention and living outside of a state in self-sufficiency. As Philippe Bourgois wrote, we could compare the jibaro symbol with the oppositional resistance culture that emerged in New York streets in the 90s as a reaction to the exploitation and the marginalization. And this is something that the members actually really put, that they see themselves as this kind of descendant from this resistance. And then we could say that actually the culture of fondo is a rest or renewal from this past resistance. But, and this is where there's a but, if we take for granted there's a risk of, first of all, mythologizing the jibaro, plus it actually ignores the way this means of survival interact with the state. And I think this is one of the limitations of the informal concept. By drawing a static dichotomy between informal and formal, we don't acknowledge the complex interrelation between the jibaro society and the colonial state, nor do we acknowledge the relationship between the gang or the association and the contemporary state. For example, since 1970, federal transfer in form of welfare and coupons constitute a third of the income per capita of the Puerto Rican population. In the Nietas, in the association, the members who are not working are all on the welfare benefits, and also the majority of the men are benefiting from the women members who are on the welfare as single mothers. So a majority of the association members are now living on a shelter system that is provided by the state. So then this kind of static dichotomy between informal and formal failed to account the interpretation of the formal into the informal. Looking at the fondo as a new informality reacting to neoliberalization of the global economy would prevent from saying the ways this form of resource has been mobilized by the past in the relationship with the colonial states or the elites. If the jibaro could have developed a second economy or shadow economy, depriving the state of some public revenue, the extent to which these activities actually depend on the infrastructure and the channels of distribution that are clearly controlled by the state is significant. It is exactly the same argument that we can address with the association members. So there is a need for historically contextualized approach here to highlight the fact that informal channels of resources and power are just as much a project of the post-colonial state as a result of its predation. So now the second argument about this kind of informal theory is that it postulates a basis for the survival, which postulates an exit strategy, in that here the individual or the group is retreating from the state and the formal market resources network by liberating in an informal kind of network. So when you talk about gangs, and I'm not just talking about Los Nietas, but when you talk about gangs in New York, the first idea is that, well, basically it's people who are living from drugs, and that they're not paying any taxes, so they're not part of this state economy. Yet, the present studies of informal or parallel economies and network fail to explain how this break operates, and even if it's totally possible. But moreover, one cannot disengage from something without engaging in something else. For example, in the association, being a brother or a sister means being integrated in a community and cultivating ties that are themselves filled with power relationship, domination, and struggle. The association revolves around socially defined power relationships. Engaging in the system of production as defined by this locus of power implicates in an entire system of authority and control. A system that is so codified that we could actually ask ourselves to what extent these informal power hierarchies are not in some way formal. So here I want to go on actually what do we not say when we use the concept of informality, and this is my conclusion. So basically I could sum up the literature on informality on two positions. The first one that posits that informality is a tool in the state governance, and the second one that argue for bringing the society back and talk about strategies, survival or resistance. The theoretical construct employed in the study of these informal realms has been formulated almost solely in terms of the state itself. Informal spheres are defined by the state. They exist and are analyzed as reaction either to the state failure or to its predation. And this is where my point is. I think there's a Manichaean conception of state-society relationship that result in a false dichotomy between formal, institutional, and informal residual categories. And we actually have to question the extent to which the power bases of those two realms are clearly delineated. To what extent these realms have histories or are ascribed in historical power histories. The parallel economy or the shadow economies might not actually be a new phenomenon, as the sudden attention to their proliferation might suggest. There is a need for a genealogy of this concept, taking account the proliferation of scientific literature on the informality and why there is such proliferation of literature on that subject. There is actually a risk of a double essentialization. First, each concept has an history and a locus of power. As I said, the concept for the urban studies came from the African cities. But then with this idea of theory from the South and this idea of circulations of concept, it has been used in a lot of Latin American cities, but also in US cities. And I think we have been used with the same idea of the state failures and the relationship with the state. And this is something that we have to take care of. Because, as I said, each concept has a locus of emergence and a history. And it comes with a particular political concept and a political connotation in the concept. Informality is actually not a neutral concept, and we need to understand what are the politics and production behind this notion. But there's also a risk of categorizing as informal the social practice of the others. For my example, as Bourgeois warns us, the concept of ribaro cannot be fixed in a simple culturalist category as a relic from a traditional rural past. Then addressing the fundo only as a rest, as a maintenance, or even as a renewal of an old tradition will risk to essentialize on a cultural basis a practice. So going along with Janet Roitman's argument, the tendency to posit the opposition between state and society leaves actually no conceptual space for the multiplicity of forms. And she calls for a pluralization of regulatory authority. It is a polyform scenario that requires a non-static, historically and socially contextualized approach which treats several variables at one time. At least we need to interrogate ourselves on the performatic effect of such concept of informality, and mostly for the public policies that are going to be made with this idea of informality. And that goes back to the use of the World Bank or the IMF of the concept of informality and how it has been implemented in a local NGO work, for example. Thank you very much.